Hello and welcome to Skeleton Songs. I'm Lottie Bevan.
And I'm Alexis Kennedy. We've been in lockdown too long.
We have.
I'm Alexis Kennedy the eunuch. That was my impersonation. I've been reading a lot of Greek fiction, so there's been a lot of eunuchs.
Unicorns.
No, actually.
I'm a unicorn.
There've been minotaurs.
Yeah.
Not sure if that's relevant for today's
I think
episode.
it is. I think we should start with a question.
42.
What is the... there might be 42 of them. What is the connection between the Labyrinths of Night and the Bright Ditches?
Ooh. Obviously, I have no clue. What are they?
I'll say at the end of the podcast.
What?
What
is a
people are like,
punishment?
oh my God, I have to keep listening. Because, these people are really boring and they keep banging on about lockdown and unicorns.
Yeah, people are bored there. They're bored enough that they will wait for the
we
answer
hope
to
so.
your question.
Labyrinths.
Yes.
What is a labyrinth, Lottie Bevan?
Well, my understanding is that it is a maze that is specifically designed to lead the wanderer to a particular point, as opposed to an actual maze, which is to confuse them and you can get out of it.
I think it's a really good definition of something that's basically undefinable, because it means all sorts of different things depending on who you're talking to. So it's the Greek word for maze, or from the Greek word, which is labyrinthos or something. Specifically, I think, underground maze. And over time, labyrinths have, as you pointed out, been associated with unicursal mazes. That is, mazes where there's actually only one way through and you can't get lost. And mazes tend to be more general. And of course, the most famous labyrinth is...
The Labyrinth of the Minotaur.
Correct.
In Thebes?
In Knossos, but I won't tell anyone you said it was Thebes.
Yeah, they weren't listening.
It's Crete.
I mean, close enough.
So, one of my etymological disappointments, and I have so many, is that labyrinth, I grew up thinking it was from labrys, meaning the double-headed axe, which is associated with the mother goddess of Crete and points east, and is consequently a lesbian symbol. I think a lot of sort of cultural lesbians have labrys tattoos.
Really?
Yeah. And it's a plot point in a film called, I think, Bound, which was the Wachowski brothers, as they were then, sisters as they are now, first essay into feature filmmaking, which is a surprisingly brilliant and also kind of hot sort of heist intrigue thriller with Jennifer Tilly, Gina Gershon, both of whom became lesbian icons, I think, after the film, and Joe Pesci. I don't mean Joe Pesci. I mean Joe Pantoliano. Joe Pantoliano is the guy from The Matrix who portrays him in the first film.
Okay.
And we're way off the point, but you should watch Bound. It's surprisingly good. You can see they were talented even then. Anyway, but I think Jennifer Tilly character has a labrys tattoo. But it turns out it's probably not from labrys. It's probably from a word meaning narrow street or a word meaning underground tunnel, and the phonetic similarity is coincidental. Hasn't stopped me using that in Cultist Simulator to imply it is, because of course the horned axe, as you were aware...
I was going to say, it sounds rather suspiciously like the horned axe. I'm not sure how much we can talk about her, because I know that there are some things we haven't said.
No, but I can talk about the associated context. So the horned axe is one of the hours, the quasi-gods of Cultist Simulator. And when I gave Sarah directions to draw the tarot card... This
is Sarah Gordon, who did all our beautiful tarot illustrations, to be clear.
I suggested Crete as one of the reference points for the ruined landscape that she drew, and I brought in Hawthorne because it's got specific relevances to specific mythological aspects around Crete and Knossos. But the reason that we are talking about labyrinths today is because this season of Skeleton Songs is largely companion pieces to revisiting a bunch of articles that both Lottie and I did on various game-adjacent topics. And I wrote a piece about labyrinths.
About how they reflect game design.
Or is it the game design reflects labyrinths?
Yeah, it's the first one. And you made a bunch of very interesting points, and you can read this article on our blog if you're interested, weatherfactory.biz. But something that stuck out for me specifically was that you said game design is about creating designed experiences aimed at leading the player in a particular direction. And one of the real marks of good game design or effective game design is that the player sort of knows what to expect without it being boring. And I think a labyrinth is a great metaphor for that, because if we replace the Minotaur at the centre of the most famous labyrinth with, I don't know, a lovely cake, so that people don't feel that it's stressful, people know that at some point, if they're in that labyrinth, they're going to get to the lovely cake, and that's great. But it's not boring, because every time they turn a corner, something else might be there, or they might find the cake. So it's not like, oh God, I've got to go on this hour-long walk before I get my lovely cake. It's actually a really enjoyable experience of what's around this corner and when am I going to get there and who am I going to meet along the way. Is that a fair summation?
That's a better summation than what I was going to give, actually. So yes,
I bet yours didn't have cake in it.
That was my first mistake. Yours didn't have kittens in it, though, which was your first mistake.
Ah, damn.
And although if a kitten was alone in the labyrinth, it would be so frightened.
I would zoom through that labyrinth.
But what did Theseus use to get back from the centre of the labyrinth, thanks to Ariadne?
He used a red string, didn't he?
A clue, a yarn, so your kitten would have that to play with.
Yeah, and they bite through it, thus totally destroying any ability to get out. But hang on, if the labyrinth is a designed experience that is designed to lead you one way and then out again.
Well, this is the thing.
Nonsense.
So first of all, this is what I was saying earlier, is that labyrinth means two things. One, in modern usage, it tends to mean a unicursal maze. But two, in the original Greek sense, it obviously just meant maze, probably underground.
Right, so Theseus was probably just in a maze rather than a labyrinth.
So the whole point is Daedalus built the labyrinth to be really confusing. Well, it's an irony, but it's also, I think, the root of the paradox, because a labyrinth, a designed experience that's maze-like, there is only one path through it. Once you've taken a path through it, that's the path you've taken, including doubling back and wrong turns. And when you're designing a game, or a story that has red herrings, or a maze that people traverse, you are designing for one of several ideal, or you're designing for an ideal experience. And there probably won't be one ideal experience for everyone, but people will tend to hew to the same sort of experience, because you don't really want a maze where people end up going round and round. So let me give you a couple of examples of what I'm talking about. In the very first text parser game, which variously is being called Adventure and Colossal Adventure and Colossal Cave and things, and which I played on the University of Oxford Atmospheric Physics Department's green screen mainframe terminal when I was about 11, for reasons beyond the scope of this podcast. There is a maze of twisty little passages all alike. And the maze of twisty little passages all alike is a dozen plus identical locations. And if you go north from one of the maze of twisty little passages, you'll end up with another place called the maze of twisty little passages all alike. And if you draw a map, it's... I
was going to say, to be clear, this sounds old, and therefore I assume it doesn't have a graphical interface.
No, this is go north, you're in a maze of twisty little passages all alike.
So text only.
Go east, you're in a maze of twisty little passages all alike.
That's a whole other level of labyrinth complication.
And... The passages don't. So if you go north, you might end up in one place, but then to get back to where you came from, you might have to go west, because of course the map isn't a real physical map. It's just a set of instructions about what directions will take you where. So how, Lottie Bevan, do you map a labyrinth, all of which locations look identical, and where the routes to and from are intentionally confusing?
You drop a kitten at every intersection.
Yes, actually.
Yeah, well, I was assuming it was something along the lines of you have to mark it yourself. So I don't know, chalk crosses on the.
So you drop
plane.
items, and because the game was designed in a nastier era of game design, occasionally a pirate will pop out of the shadows and steal one of your items. So you might
Pirates.
Be able to, But that's how you map it. And in fact, there's a slightly more obscure bit of text parser lore. The very first multiplayer dungeon, multiplayer online text-based whatnot, which was called MUD, for Multi-User Dungeon, at the University of Essex in the 80s or something. There was a maze in that, which was a swamp. The thing about a swamp is if you drop things...
Oh, no!
Yeah. So the only way to find the centre of the swamp maze was with teamwork, because players are the only items that don't sink.
So you leave not Benny at the outpost, and then you
you feel
drop
basically
Julia
human
off,
chain
and
through the maze, and you say,
and then occasionally someone gets eaten by an alligator.
yes.
Fair.
But the point is, there's just one route, and you're given a solution you're expected to use, and everyone converges on the same solution. Relatedly, there's a guy called Adrian Chmielaj, and there's any Poles who listen to this are going, oh yeah, pronunciation not bad for an Angliski, but my god, his accent. Adrian is a Polish game designer who made, among other things, he was the lead on Vanishing of Ethan Carter,
which I have a very funny experience of.
I want to hear about that in a minute. And Adrian did a sort of he did a walkthrough of the beginning of BioShock Infinite, and he pointed out that the way that we explore first-person shooter games, which have branching paths, I mean literally branching paths, literally different corridors, is when we take the right route, we've never taken the wrong route. Because what happens is you're exploring it and you think, oh, I need to get all the loot. And you find the end of the level and you think, oh, I don't want to go here because I haven't got all the loot. So you go back and you search for all the dead ends.
Well,
so you can find them and hoover up the loot.
This is what I first thought about when we were talking about Labyrinths. I'm not a game designer, so I found your sort of parallels really interesting. But I was thinking about AAA game design. Because I love my AAA open world RPGs. But I literally cannot tell you the last one that I finished. And I know that's a classic kind of, oh, lol, games are too long and whatever. But that's not really my point. My point is that I enjoy the experience of being, for example, a Greek assassin, that I want to spend as long as I can in that world. So I will actively avoid pursuing the main quest often, because I'm stressed that if I follow the main quest, some of the paths that are currently open to me, some of the quests in the place I am in, or that I haven't even necessarily found, will close off to me, because suddenly I'll accidentally trigger a cutscene where I have to fight a battle or sail on a ship or something, and I'll lose the ability to explore the labyrinth that they have carefully laid out for me. But with your analogy, the designer has lovingly and painstakingly over a series of years built this beautiful labyrinth, which is the one aim of which is to lead me through the narrative to the end point of the game. And I pointedly try not to do that. So it's an interesting conundrum, I think, that the player and the designer are at odds, because normally I'd say that sounds like not the system working as intended. But I think I'm probably not alone in having this approach to AAA games, because I do, as you get closer to the centre of the labyrinth, the stakes get higher and you have more like bosses and you have more like stressful experiences. And I'm not super into that. I just want to kind of do all the side quests and get all the loot. And I'm not averse to having an ending or something at the centre of the labyrinth, but I think it's interesting that actually often you can make such a wonderful labyrinth that people don't really want to leave it, which is kind of at odds with the experience of being in some maze and trying to find the exit.
I think, like a lot of art, I used to have this semi-joke about Kennedy's first law of narrative, which is that the first third of a narrative is always the best part. Because a lot more stories
honeymoon period
disappoint at the end.
Endings are hard,
and also it's sort of a cheat, because if you don't get through the beginning, you'll never see the ending, so you can't be disappointed by it. So if the beginning is the worst part, and this is games, right? The same sort of experience. Usually the best part of a game is the first third or so, when you're getting into it.
That's true.
You're starting to explore it before it starts to settle into feeling like a slog. Yeah. And endings are really hard, because again and again when you're designing the experience, you get the sense that you want some sort of climax or crescendo, otherwise it will just peter out. But it's difficult to build a climax or crescendo that doesn't feel like a betrayal of the gaming experience up to that point.
Well, this is exactly my Vanishing of Ethan Carter story, made by the man, if you could say his name again so I don't have to.
Adrian Chmielaj.
Yeah, he's great. And The Vanishing of Ethan Carter, for anyone who hasn't heard of it or played it, is it fair to call it a sort of spooky walking sim adventure thing? Well, that's what you think. So, it's I believe it's actually set in something that looks like Polish countryside. It's very beautiful, it's graphically gorgeous, and like I said, I'm more the chill side of gaming, so I love a sort of spooky narrative that I can uncover whilst basically buggering about in a beautiful environment and not having to worry too much about fighting a boss. So I spent a lot of my childhood watching my father game, and I was spending the holidays with him. I was at school at the time, and he was playing the Vanishing of Ethan Carter, so I happily sat with him and watched him play it and said helpful things like, look over there, or you've missed that thing, or did you turn left at the tree, which is my helpful contribution to these things. And I watched him play it for sort of 2-3 hours. It's quite a short game, like most walking sims. And he got up to like take a phone call or get some tea or something, and I thought definitely, all right, well, I'll just take control for a moment, shall I? I'll just have a little poddle around because I've been enjoying watching him, but I've got the itch now. And literally, it turns out that I took control of the game at the one point where you can actually be attacked. So having spent an entire game watching this sort of totally like beautiful, like elegiac, like walking sim where no harm could come to me, I'm at the start of this spooky mine shaft and I wander through it, and this sort of music gets a bit spooky, but I'm like, I'm not fooled, game. I know that this is a walking sim. So I go through, and then suddenly there's some sort of terrifying noise and a light and a zombie man, and I'm dead. And Dad comes back and says, what have you done? but I've never really recovered from that. I feel like the Labyrinth betrayed me. That's a great example of heightening the tension, I guess, because they'd introduced a totally new game mechanic that, had I not switched over and started playing from that point, probably would have had a really great, profound impact on the player, because they would have thought, oh my god, this is actually, the stakes have changed. But obviously I found it like sort of falling out of one labyrinth into a
and I think
nest of snakes.
A lot of really interesting games and stories and films and books and whatnot, the more interesting it is, the more disappointing it is going to be to some people, because
the ending,
if they do something different. So, for example,
Game of Thrones.
Well, they were. You know what? I'm not going to open that box. And for the record, listeners, I enjoyed Game of Thrones, and you should have seen it coming with that blonde loony. But the nobody's that pretty without.
She was so pretty.
Nice, but the so to take a really trivial example, Dusk Till Dawn, the Rodriguez film with Tarantino and Clooney.
Yeah.
The conceit of it, and if this is a spoiler, then tough. You should have watched it in the last 20 years. It starts out being a film about two people on the run who inveigle a family into their escape from the law, and it ends up being a sort of vampire siege zombie movie. And it's brilliant because it's a total surprise. Unless you've looked at like the front of the VCR cover, because it's like the VCR days, and it's covered in zombies and Selma Hayek in a bikini.
And it has an establishment whose name is so rude we can't say it on this podcast.
Yes, that's right. The witty Tista. But I didn't know what I was watching when I went into the sixth form common room and sat down. So it was a hell of a surprise for me.
You were watching that in sixth form?
Yeah, it was a weird school.
Permissive.
We left it. So many stories I could tell you about that. Anyway, but the point is that there are a number of people who would sit up, bolt upright at that point and go, well, I was in this for a film starring George Clooney escaping across the border, not about freaking vampires. And the same thing with people who play, for example, Cultist Simulator or Sun and Sea, where we do deliberately provoking things. And again, to be clear, because I don't want to suggest I'm some sort of fucking genius, that there are problems with the game design in both those games that could have been fixed without undermining the central premise.
And it's a hell of a thing to market. Yeah.
But the point is that if you subvert expectations, then you excite some people and you disappoint others. And that is often one of the reasons why art is a very popularity. But now we use the A word, so we've got to
run away from that. Quick, back to Labyrinths and say something else about, I don't know, food.
So we got this far into the episode about Labyrinths without mentioning Borges, and
are we going to be fined?
I won't tell anyone if you don't. So he loved Labyrinths, and a collection of stories is called Labyrinths, and he wrote famously The Garden of Forking Paths, which is about it sort of prefigures, if you take the claims at face value, like quantum physics and interactive fiction and things, and I think like a lot of claims about Borges, he did a sort of playful thing which you can which is intended to have things read into it. But in short, Garden of Forking Paths, our protagonist is a Chinese teacher of English who is working as a spy for the Germans in World War II and World War II, World War One, I forget. And he he's assisting the Germans, he makes a point of saying, not because he has any taste for the Germans, but because he wants to prove to the Germans that Chinese are not inferior and that he can help them. And similarly suggests the British spy who's pursuing him, Captain Richard Madden, because he's an Irish Catholic, simply wants to prove to the British that the Irish are useful. Mm-hmm. So there seems to be a kind of a theme in the story that I don't understand entirely the way that it weaves in. And he is being pursued by Madden, and he needs to get to his German superiors the location of a British artillery site. Mm-hmm. And he's got no way of reaching his superior in Berlin, although the superior in Berlin, he knows, reads the newspapers for looking for coded messages for him. So inexplicably, he gets on a train to go to a little village where a friend of his lives, a Dr. Albert. And Dr. Albert is a sinologist, a student and authority on Chinese culture and literature, and is pleased to see him, and they have tea and talk, and we have again, I guess this is thematically the opposition, that we've got a Chinese teacher of English, Irish Catholic who's serving the British, and a sinologist who has a library of Chinese texts but is very English, and they talk about an ancestor of our protagonists. The ancestor was a scholar in medieval China who shut himself up in the pavilion of the limpid sun for 11 years and said he was going to build a labyrinth, and he also said he was going to write a novel, and he ended up producing this incomprehensible novel that doesn't make any sort of plot sense. And the sinologist who our protagonist has come to visit has worked out the secret of this novel, and he says that everybody thought the labyrinth and the novel were separate things, and actually the labyrinth and the novel were the same thing. And the novel is intended to be an exploration of all possible futures. That's why somebody can be dead in one chapter and alive in another. And when in one chapter an army marches across through a past and finds it very gloomy, and so they lose all interest in life, so they fight without care for their own lives, so they win the battle. And in another they pass through this landscape and it's beautiful, and this inspires them to a sense of wonder and delight, and they fight like men possessed, and so they still win the battle. And they talk about history and time, and the clue that the sinologist observed in the book is that it nowhere uses the word time, so therefore it must be about time. And
it's a bold claim.
And then he gets up to hand the manuscript to our protagonist to have another look at, and the protagonist shoots him in the back of the head.
What?
Yeah, because the protagonist is being pursued by the terrifying Captain Richard Madden. In fact, he only just escaped him at the station, and he knows that Madden will be even now coming to the house of the sinologist, and he's about to be arrested. So Madden takes him in, and he...
Wait, why did he shoot the sinologist?
And he... all be revealed. And he's sentenced to be hanged, and he's sitting in his cell waiting to be hanged, saying, but the abominable victory is still mine, because the Germans have now bombed the British artillery site, because he managed to convey to them the name of the city, which was Albert, or Albert, I think it's in France. Mm. So he killed Dr. Albert, the sinologist. It was reported in the papers he had inexplicably killed his friend, Dr. Albert, the sinologist. And so the Germans worked out that... Mm. Anyway, there's an after note in which the person who found the manuscript from this Chinese dude, because of course this is Borges thing, it's all epistolary stuff and found MSers, says this is all nonsense and it's not true, because Captain Richard Madden actually died trying to arrest the Prussian spy who our protagonist mentions in passing at the beginning of the story, so we could never have hunted it down. So we're left uncertain about whether or not it's something that actually happened, or whether it's a playful future, or whether the Chinese dude lied for his own reasons. And this is, because if you're Borges, you can get away with this, and people say, "Oh, you're so brilliant."
Yeah, you see, this is you and David Lynch again. This is sort of, oh look, it's meant to be incredibly annoyingly unfinished.
I mean, I yield to no one, as you know, in my admiration for Lynch, but
and I wouldn't ask you to, darling. I'd just ask you not to make me watch it.
Inland Empire was an hour too long, and is what happens if you let David Lynch out without strict control of his budget. And one of Borges' many virtues is that all his short stories are extremely short, and so you can get through it and enjoy the point.
I appreciate that.
So you don't have to sit around waiting for a resolution you know isn't going to come.
Yeah, short, sharp disappointment. That's what we like in literature.
Well, it's like life. What's the quote? Life is
brutal and brutish and short.
Life is awful and there's so little of it.
So I hope you're feeling cheered, listeners.
My ex-wife used to say that after Woody Allen thing.
Grim. Okay, so back to Labyrinth and games. Well, you mentioned interactive fiction, and apparently Borges, among his many other talents, is some sort of prefigurer of interactive fiction. And I know that those are your roots as a designer, and you're sort of moved away from that. And one of the things you said to me very early on was something you see a lot of very early interactive fiction writers doing, or inexperienced interactive fiction writers, where you give them a choice, you give the player a choice, and you essentially say something along the lines of, do you go straight ahead, left or right? And you say this is one of the cardinal sins of... To
be clear, this isn't an original observation of mine. This is
Sure, but this is you talking about something that you know something about. And I understood that it wasn't particularly interesting to play a game that just asked me if I want to go left, forward or right. But it wasn't until I read your Labyrinth article that I kind of understood it a bit more about the idea that it's important that the player knows where they're going. So do you want to talk about why that isn't a good choice?
Yeah, so I think one of the things that game design and plot in the traditional sense and stories have in common is that they are both ways to make people give a fuck about what they're looking at. That's their fundamental purpose. You play Diablo because you want the numbers to go up, but Diablo has worked.
No, you want the shiniest crown.
And you want the shiniest crown. But Diablo has worked to make you care about the shiniest crown and the numbers going up, because the numbers then mean something.
Yes.
And, similarly, if we're watching a story about two very boring thieves planning to steal a JCB, then we probably aren't that interested. If I watch a story about two hilarious misfit odd couple pals trying to steal a JCB, then we're engaged.
See, that's
with
a
them.
terrible example.
If they're trying to steal the shiniest crown, then we care about it. Because you want to see the shiniest crown. So what?
Well, just that. I don't know if this is accidental or not, but we watched recently a program called
Diamond Gazers
about basically some useless men trying to steal a JCB so they could, and I'm not joking, drive it through a wall in broad daylight and then use some hammers to break into a diamond exhibition.
I mean, you say useless men, but they literally did all those things. They nearly got away with it.
Well, except for the fact that they nearly got away with it, but they didn't, because all the police were watching them knowing they were going to do it.
That's true. And
they gave a bunch of aliases along the way when they bought useful things, literally calling themselves things like Tim Diamond. And then when they finally did break through the wall in their slightly modulated digger truck, in broad daylight, surrounded by police, and got their tiny hammers out to break into the diamond vaults, the diamonds weren't diamonds, they'd been removed and were plastic. So apart from those things, it was a phenomenal heist. But I just wondered if that was what was simmering away there.
Diamond geezer, I think so.
Back to interactive fiction.
Left, right, or straight on. So the thing is, if you say the very first, can we mention Choose Your Own Adventure without being
roundly
sued?
Yeah, there's famously a very litigious copyright owner of the phrase Choose Your Own Adventure, which, as I'm sure you probably know, comes from I think a much beloved series of books in the 80s. And Choose Your Own Adventure is something that lots of people use to describe essentially kind of branching narrative or interactive fiction or things like that, where you essentially play a narrative game and you get to choose what happens to you on an adventure. And we made the mistake of using it in some of our marketing a couple of years ago, and on Christmas Eve I got a very cross email from somebody threatening to sue me if I didn't take all of it down immediately because I was breaching copyright. And I've become aware that this has happened to many people in the indie game space who just use CYOA.
They also tried to do it to, I think, Chrysler.
Why?
Because Chrysler used "Choose Your Adventure" in a slogan. I don't think Chrysler backed
I don't think they were scared. No.
But the very first choose your adventure books, a lot of the choices, perhaps the bulk of the choices, were basically left or right, because it's the most obvious choice. To you say what you see. You look up and you think, well, I could go that way or go this way. And there's a bunch of design problems with branching path narrative as a goal rather than a. I'm not getting into that. But the point is, left or right isn't interesting. Do you go down or do you go up? Is a bit more interesting. Do you go through the ivory door or the iron door? Those are still only interesting if you plug it back into something meaningful. So if you say, do you go down or do you go up? And the player realises that actually it's just every time you say go up, it's it was a trap, you fall into a pit. Then that's not fun. And this is why often system-based approaches are more fruitful than I did get into it. Branching narrative approaches, because what system-based approaches allow you to do is learn the system and then have some sense of which decisions are likely to be important in which ways. But left or right or straight on is a joke about what's most and least interesting. The thing is, of course, not all choices have to be interesting. Lots of people play visual novels, or what was that bartender thing that was much beloved, Valhalla, I think it's called.
Yeah.
So I could not get into it at all. And it seems that one of the reasons I could not get into it was the reason a lot of people loved it, because you go through, you read a lot of text and you make some intentionally fairly sort of low stress choices, and the story just unfolds in front of you. It drove me mad. I wanted real choices that I felt affected at least a number that was going up and down, but that's not necessarily what people want. Often they want sort of a light overlay of feeling that they've had some sort of input.
That's exactly what Firewatch was like. Did you play Firewatch?
Oh yes.
So a much beloved narrative game with just very, very beautiful and elegant and excellent. But it opens with this really bizarre kind of interactive fiction-y opening. I don't know if you remember it. It's a text screen. Before you get into any of the world,
I do.
You know anything about the characters, you get this sort of backstory where I can't remember, it's sort of, I don't know, maybe 5 choices, and you get a sort of situation on the screen which says, Frank came home from work one night a bit drunk, and you get 3 options, and one of it was, you fall asleep on the couch, you kiss your wife goodnight, or you smash up the table, or whatever it is. And it tells quite a sad story, and you make your choices and you find out something about the backstory, and then that section sort of stops, and what I feel like the game begins, which I found very jarring, especially coming at the start, because I didn't know anything about the characters, and it didn't have any obvious effects on the storyline, although I understand it did probably have some effects on maybe some of the things you find as you explore this world. But it certainly doesn't change anything significant about the plot. And people really liked it because they felt they had some sort of involvement in the characters from the off. They didn't have that sort of, I'm meeting a stranger and I grow to love them. They immediately felt engaged with the central character who's alone in this situation in the rest of the game.
Well, this is one of the great secrets about choice design, the enclosed, is that nothing matters.
Oh, we're back to nihilism.
And
have some more lovely cake.
What you often see in advertising for CRPGs is choices that matter.
Yeah.
And what choices that matter usually means is that they've taken a branching path rather than a systemic approach to the narrative, and that basically you can side with the elves or the dwarves. And if you side with the elves, you'll talk to an elf in chapter 5, and if you side with the dwarves, you'll talk to a dwarf in chapter 5.
And they'll fight for you in the final battle.
Yeah, and that sounds like a put down, and it's not meant to be a put down, because this works. It has an effect. You think, there's a reason I side with this lot, and I'm revisiting my choice, and it validates me. But ultimately, when you put the game down, it doesn't make much difference. All branching path based choices ultimately leads to you seeing different title cards at the end. It's just sometimes the title cards come up before the end. But people do care about that as well. So it's when I say nothing matters, it's only in the sense that everything matters, because you can get an effect from it. And obviously, the counterpoint of this is if you choose the elves and you never see another elf in the game, then you feel you've been cheated. Of course, if you choose the elves and then you don't finish the game, you don't feel cheated. If you choose the elves and it means that you care about the fact you chose the elves, then you don't feel cheated. And if you play through a little branching path narrative at the beginning of a big walking simulatory game, and it makes you feel differently about what comes next, then you don't feel cheated. the point is then there's some art in designing decisions that allow you not to feel cheated in the first place, because if you just say it's been a multiple choice personality test and now you have to feel differently about the game.
I love those though. I love doing the multiple choice personality test at the end. They're like, you're a Taurus and you're an EAG personality type and you should always wear a hat. I love that.
So you don't feel cheated.
But then it's funny you talk about this because I've played a lot of RPGs. I'm not specifically attracted to the choices mattering stuff, but I've played a lot where that was part
Well, I've
of
seen
it.
you playing CRPGs on the PlayStation, and what you do is you every time a content point comes up where you might lose a bit of story or might get a result you don't want, you go straight to the wiki. And
but this is my point. So it's funny that you talk about feeling cheated, because I can't remember any game I have ever played where I have made choices that mattered, and I made a choice and it mattered. What I do remember is two things: either making a choice that I felt was not respected later on in the game, so I chose the elves, but inexplicably I'm still fighting with the dwarves at the end of the game, which feels like a bug or some sort of broken design, or more significantly, I made a choice that was then flung back in my face. So my constant beef, not that I hold grudges.
This is Dragon Age Origins.
This is Dragon Age Origins, where a big draw of the Dragon Age franchise and the BioWare thing is that you can romance people, which I'm not normally into. I don't really care. I mean, I want people to be attractive and I can look at them, but I really don't care about forming meaningful relationships with people in game.
You'd rather look at a rose than look at an elephant, as Vigdis Faspo used to say.
Very true. And my rose of choice was Alistair, the handsome, noble, heir to the throne. He was a doofus, but he was sweet. And I also, I wasn't taking it seriously. I had a dog as my captain who ran in front of battle and just nipped at everyone's knees. But I romanced Alistair, and I thought, you know what, for this one time I'm going to take it seriously and I'm going to properly follow it through. And we had a really romantic kiss on the battlements, and he gave me a rose that I pointedly kept in my inventory, even though it stopped me being able to carry everything I wanted, because I thought, this is meaningful. And then again, this is quite an old game, so spoilers, but I think you'll forgive me. At the end of it, he buggers off with the sex witch and has a baby, and regardless of his love for me, which felt, it was powerful. So I'm not saying the writers made a mistake, but I felt that wasn't signposted, and I looked it up afterwards in a fury, and there's apparently a decision sort of halfway through the game which you can make, which at the time, if you make what feels very clearly the right decision, the kind, empathetic decision, this leads you down this path of despair and betrayal. Whereas if you make, at the time, what is quite a harsh decision, he becomes something like hardened, but that the game doesn't tell you that. But later on, the fact that he has gone through a difficult decision halfway through the game means that he is able to resist some problem at the end of the game, which means he doesn't bugger off with the sex witch and have a baby. But the game, I certainly didn't pick up on that. And this was the one time that I was committed to this kind of on-screen relationship, and then the game said, oh no, sex witch baby time. So my poor broken heart will never heal, and I will never love another pixelated man.
I'll make you a cup of tea and you feel better.
And well, we need to finish as well.
We do. I've got a couple more things to say.
Well, you've got to tell them about
I haven't forgotten, don't worry. In my... so the first game I made was this... sorry, there was a scissors problem. The first game I made was this bagatelle called Fallen London, which almost 12 years later is still going. And... initially, so Fallen London is played in real time and is persistent, and they're getting some bonus material. Lottie just pointed at the time.
Revealing the tips of podcasting.
It's persistent. You have one character that you play forever, and I loved the idea when I started writing it that you had consequences you had to live with, and there was real tension about the choices. You couldn't just reload, and like a lot of interesting things. This came with problems that ultimately was, I think, a mistake. To be fair to me, it was partly a mistake because I first launched Fallen London just on the cusp of sort of wikis becoming a thing in video games. But I realised ultimately, of fucking course, if you got not just 6 hours, but 6 months in a character, if you're going to make a decision that is going to influence either the fiction or the mechanical side of it, you want some fucking idea about what the decision you're making, and it's legit to want to go to a wiki to look at that. Also helpful for the game to be able to signal what are important decisions. And I think there's a phase a lot of game designers go through in the sort of journeyman part of their careers, where they start to realise that being a magician who creates a world that players have to take on its own terms is not really where their job ends. That you need at least to give people an idea of what they're getting into, and if you make all decisions look equally trivial or important, then you'll end up frustrating your players, even though that's what the air quotes real world is like, because games
that is
aren't
not
like
why
the
we're
real
playing
world.
games.
Exactly. Yeah. And the player's experience is when you ignore it, you're at your peril. Like a labyrinth design, if you design a labyrinth that delivers the player into a spiked pit, then maybe that's what you intended. Maybe it's not. Shall I say
Not
what
very
the
fun for the player.
connection between Labyrinth Noctis and Claritas Fossae is?
Yes, please.
Well, I've given this away now by using the Latin. They're both terrain features on Mars.
No
Labyrinth
way!
is not. I forget where the endings are, but Labyrinth Noctis or something is the big old network of like canyons that you see in that sort of dark patch across the middle of Mars, and at its western end, it moves into the bright canyons, which is named for a high albedo feature when they're first naming Mars. So that's the connection.
Oh, that's magical.
The Labyrinths of Night and the
So what are we going to find at the centre of the Martian labyrinth? That's the question science is desperately trying to answer.
Perseverance. I mean, it's the name of a rover, but it's also like abstract now.
But we're not going to find it at the centre of Mars.
I know, but it was like a sort of clever pun where I said, "It's what you find at the centre of a labyrinth, perseverance." Have a spooky day.